This is Matt here with Mike McVey, and Mike is my new co-host of this podcast. Mike is also a podcast host with his own podcast. Would you like to talk about that real quick, Mike?
Sure. I have the pleasure of hosting Nobody's a Nobody podcast where I interview people that aren't necessarily famous, but I've met them in some walk of life here or there and just find their lives absolutely interesting and have conversations with them about themselves. And you were one of the guests we had, one of the more recent ones.
Yeah.
So,
So that was a lot of fun for me, and I received a lot of good feedback on it. And I think that really started stimulating the conversation about whether or not you and I could do something together. It was a cool experience, being able to talk about the stuff that I've spent my whole life working in and studying and learning stuff about. So that was really cool for me. But I felt I learned a lot too about about I guess what I do and how I do it and how I think about things. So that was a really good experience, sharing that space with you and having you ask really good questions. So that's kind of led us to this point. And what we've discussed about as a general theme for the podcast going forward is kind of talking about, in light of what the New Next originally was going to be about, but more to the business, energy, finance side, and really get into some topics a little bit deeper, but in, I would say, a little shorter format. So
right.
yeah. So like one of the things that we've talked about discussing are geopolitics and how that relates to energy and finance. And another thing that we've talked about is talking about stuff like ESG, which is environmental social governance, what it is, how it's doing, and how it's affecting markets across the globe, and also stuff like minerals. So we've got a I think a large thing of really interesting things to talk about, and I love this stuff. Like I love this
Yeah.
stuff so much, and it's pretty cool, that like I'm really grateful for the opportunity to actually talk about this stuff with someone who might not be an expert in that, but
Yeah,
is an
that's for sure.
expert, yeah, an expert in asking cool questions and is naturally inquisitive.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, for those of you who don't know me, I know very little about most of those subjects. I know off and on about business on certain scales, but I really don't know a lot about geopolitics. In fact, whenever I hear geopolitics, first thing my mind goes to is GeoCities website, which probably is a little bit different. I know it's not the same thing, but that's where my mind goes naturally. And
That's a great name drop, by the way.
yeah, if only they were still around and worth anything. But yeah, I mean, we've had several talks on different subjects, and it's always a pleasure to hear you get really passionate about some of these subjects. And I'm just like, oh wow, I probably take news from unlikely sources. I mean, only whenever enough people talk about something do I go and look it up. So it's kind of cool to have someone that this is kind of your heartbeat. This is where you're looking to, and trying to understand it. So if you're out there like me and you don't necessarily understand some of these complex things at first, maybe my inquisitive nature will help bring it to a more common understanding for us non-technical folk.
Yeah, and they're complex topics, but there's a lot of stuff that's intertwined and interrelated. So that's part of the reason why I enjoy this stuff so much and why I've spent my life studying it. I really got into learning about energy in the first place because of my interest in finance and financial markets and economics. So that was as a teenager. I'm much older now and much wiser in some ways, and some ways not. But it's yeah, I really like. I've always liked machines. I grew up in the boat industry. I like understanding how big things move and how things are interconnected. And I really, with energy, I feel like it's, for a lot of people, it just kind of shows up and it's a bill that you pay every month. But there's this incredibly complex, uh, you know, infrastructure kind of system behind it. And I just find that so interesting. So after I was on Nobody's a Nobody a while back, some people reached out and were like, I didn't understand how complex energy was. And that was a cool thing for me to get feedback on. So I'm really excited to explore a lot of these topics with you and see where it goes.
Yeah, definitely.
What what are you hoping to kind of get out of this whole experience?
Yeah, that's a question I probably should have spent more time recently thinking about. Number one, and this will probably always come back to it. Number one is, we have a friendship and I value greatly, and it's really nice to get to talk to you on multiple levels about different subject matter. And so just having the connection with you is probably the number one thing. Number two, we're human beings. We all need sustenance and stuff. So, there's always the hope that something cool comes out of it. And then all of a sudden, we're multi-trillionaires and,
From a podcast?
yes, yes, yes. Suck it, Joe Rogan.
That's hilarious.
But, it's being able to learn how to talk intelligently and how to understand complex things, because everything complex can be made simple without losing the complexity. But to really be able to master it, you can't just be on the job. You have to do off the job kind of things. And that's really any subject. It doesn't really matter if it's energy or sports. You can talk about sports all day, but until you actually start getting involved with the players or with the team's finances and stuff, you really don't have a good gist of it. It's just a fan thing. So this will definitely help create, for me, the opportunity to understand some of the complexity of the different things that you're passionate about, and hopefully, like I said earlier, be able to vocalize it for those of us who don't necessarily have a grasp on that, and also be able to ask some of the, for us simple folk, some questions that might seem like obvious, or um, that might be taken for granted sometimes by those in your industry, and you're able to help break down like why this is important. So it hopefully, universal understanding, world peace, and becoming trillionaires, while also talking with my friend regularly. So that just minor goals.
Yeah, totally. Well, those are cool goals. One thing that you really talked about too that I would like to get out of this is finding a way to bridge that understanding and make these complex ideas, I would say, easier to communicate in a more broader context. So a lot of, yeah, I think like generally most people, and I'm making a generalization here, but most people don't understand the energy industry. And there's a lot of slogans and stuff that sounds good, but it's usually more complex than that. And I've really seen it become more of a political, um, I'm not sure what to say, but kind of like a political platform in recent years without respecting the importance of it.
Right.
And that's been interesting to watch. And I think most times very unproductive for end goals. So with me, like I'm so deep in this energy, minerals, finance, that it's I want to understand or learn myself how to develop my communications skills in a way that I can talk about it with a more broader subset with people and potentially have a different conversation than people are used to hearing with it.
Right. Well, and it makes sense a little bit because I'm thinking back towards at least my public school education. The most we ever really talked about energy were how atoms and molecules. We talked about energy in that kind of way. We never really, and we talked a little bit about the different types of energy, but we didn't really go into much specifics. Because I'm in Oklahoma, oil, it was a little bit more popular of a thing to talk about, but even then it wasn't to depth or complexity. It was always more of just like, yeah, Oklahoma's just run by oil. That's just a common thing. And whenever there's a boom period, everybody's happy. Whenever there's a bust, everybody's really sad. And that was kind of sadly, the complexity of how we talked about oil. As an adult, I know that there's a whole lot more involvement of what oil means, and I get bits and pieces still, but I really, and we haven't, and you and I haven't really talked about oil yet, but I know that there's more to it than just someone saying, oh, I'm going to just jack up a barrel price and all of a sudden everybody's going to be sad in Oklahoma. There's more to it. And I still don't understand it. And I guess right now it's a really kind of a cool period, a really sucky period for Ukrainians right now, but it's really oil
And
is being
consumers.
affected. Yeah. It's kind of interesting to see this happen. It's the first time really as an adult in my adulthood that something has affected oil specifically so recently. So it's kind of, I think that's some of the things that brought you asking me to possibly be a part of your podcast and stuff was that you were wanting to talk about some of it and I didn't know much about it. And hopefully, with the great teaching of Matt Jensen, the world would be better, Vladimir Putin will take a call from you soon or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's okay. Pass on that. Yeah, no, it's been a really interesting year and a half. And I think with inflation too, I think a lot of people underestimate how much the price of energy goes into the cost of goods and services that we use. Like there's a lot of things where maybe the bulk of it is transportation costs. So shipping something all over the world, because you can produce it there for way cheaper than here, you're not allowed to produce it here. Or having energy costs double basically change the economics of a lot of things. So it's really it's really interesting. Like I'm sure you could look around your room right now and look for, well, like right now I see the plastic light switch on the wall, and your paint is probably oil-based paint, and you're wearing plastic earphones. Your
Yeah.
sweatshirt's probably got plastic compounds in it. So it's kind of like it's everywhere around us. And a lot of people just, I think of it as gas, oil that you put in your car,
Right.
stuff like that. But it affects everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like our whole world's built on it. And and then natural gas and wind and solar powering our homes. Like it's everywhere, but it's invisible at the same time.
Yeah, it's so commonplace that we don't usually give two thoughts about it unless we're thinking about that specific item or whatnot. And I know the thing about transportation that does something that probably hits home a little bit more because my dad has been a trucker most of my life in some capacity. In fact, is back into trucking again in his 70s. And I always think about the cost of what it would be to fly something as opposed to trucking it or using a train, or where necessary boats and stuff. And so it is kind of just that alone is really cool to think about how it affects prices or doesn't affect prices, I guess, if it's Amazon, because Amazon's always free, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so, yeah, it'll be fun. Um, I'm not sure the frequency that we'll be doing this, but we'll try to, when we record, try to record on a couple different topics and really release this around a topical podcast. rather than what I was doing originally, which were 2-hour interviews.
Hey, those
So
are fun too sometimes.
yeah, they were fun, but I, you know, I think this is more beneficial for other people, and it's what I'm really passionate about. So um, I appreciate you joining me in this journey. It's going to be
Definitely.
really cool.
I'm glad to be a part.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good way to
Okay.
leave our first podcast, which is why we're doing what we're doing and what you can expect us from us going forward. Mike's a master podcast guru, so we'll see how this goes going forward. But I really expect him to probably be leading the communication aspect in a lot of this. So I'm excited for that.
And I gave 2 thumbs up for all of those out there that can't see the non-existent video.
Well, see you on the flip side.